Good morning, everyone. If you've been teaching at the college level for very long, and if your experience is anything like mine, something of a changing landscape in your classroom, or maybe a peoplescape, a different demographic. Setting aside the increased diversity of American college students, and also setting aside whatever's been happening with graduate students, where we've had a lot of international students for a long time, especially on research university campuses. What I'm going to focus on today is the marked increase, at least in many places, of international undergrads on our campuses and in our classrooms. And over a decade nationwide, this has risen nearly a third, and it seems even more dramatic at Colorado State, at my institution, where we had 224 international students 10 years ago. Now we have 880, and so that's up 300% in 10 years, and actually it's up 23% this year, and it's just very visible, and I think it's triggered me to think about what I do in my classroom. In economics, it's somewhat even more dramatic. 19% of our students this fall are international students, and that was just 4% 7 years ago. In my Principles of Micro class, 43% of my students were international. Now that is really unusual, but it was eye-opening. And one more just comment in terms of the motivation here. While our students in our major at CSU are just about 1/5 international, half of the dean's list last spring was international. These are very good students, and they're very rewarding to work with, and that's triggered me to think about how I can do that more and more effectively. Clearly, this kind of changing classroom demographic presents both opportunities and challenge. It enriches our classroom context, for sure. I personally find it very motivating and rewarding. It certainly comes with the possibility of communication gaps, and in education, certainly some expectation gaps in terms of particular issues of student performance that we might be looking for. It's probably worth mentioning that not only do we have more and more international students in our classrooms here, but many more faculty members are teaching abroad. And so the same opportunities and challenges apply, I think, and can be really fun to address. So what do we want to do in this kind of globalized classroom that might be the same or might be different from what we would do otherwise? Well, I think it's important to think at the top level about our learning objectives. So usually that includes two types. We have affective or connective outcomes that we're seeking, and also cognitive outcomes, right? And we know that that efforts on both sides reinforce each other. So if we really want to make an optimal learning experience for our students, we might target both halves of this. And all I'd like to do today is offer a few ideas for tactics in both of these areas that maybe are very familiar to all of us, but seem especially instrumental when we have international students involved, and really deserve some special attention. Let's first think about affective success or connective success, and the question of how we can let international students feel included, connected, valued, interested in our classroom and in our teaching learning enterprise. So idea number one, learn how to pronounce our student names. I mean, obviously this is a personal touch that we'd always want to apply. Let me use just one example from my experience. Suppose you have in your class these two talented, eager students, Hang and Hung. Suppose you want to call on the student on the left, either because she volunteers or otherwise, and so you call on Hang. Well, you'll get a response from the student on the right, because that's how her name is pronounced, and the student on the left pronounces her name Hung. So I'm not obviously here to give a pronunciation lesson, but just to emphasize the idea that a certain amount of confusion and distance can be created between us and our students if we don't know how to pronounce their names. Idea number two, clearly specify expected behaviors and correct non-conforming behaviors a little bit gently or sympathetically, perhaps more than we would with domestic students. We might ask the question of whether certain behaviors are outrageous, really outrageous, or whether they're just situationally unacceptable, and instead of deserving a fairly harsh response, maybe deserve a little bit of cultural mentoring response instead. I'm not saying that we should tolerate behaviors like tardiness, chatting in class or cheating, but that we might approach students who present infractions in a little bit more sympathetic way, at least for first offenses. Idea number 3, when we pose questions in class, we should pause and have students write their answers first. Now, if I were throwing out a few numbers to my class and asking them, let's say, to calculate an elasticity, I would give them 15 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever it takes, to form their answers so that they can respond in an informed way. If we do this even with questions that we just expect, perhaps might expect relatively quick verbal answers to, we have the effect of leveling the playing field between non-native speakers and native speakers, to give them a chance to form their thoughts, shape their words, and be ready to express a good answer. And that also builds confidence for the future, for those students, about their ability to interact out loud with their American peers and feel good about it. Idea number 4. We should internationalize our course content. Now, one way to do that, of course, is global comparisons. Frankly, one of the most attractive features of the Krugman and Wells text is all the international content that's infused throughout all of the topics and not like just in the international economics chapters. A second idea is to maybe invent, among our many examples and applications, some that are especially relevant to our students. When I teach abroad, and I'm teaching, let's say, about substitutes and elasticities, I use locally relevant foods. Or when I'm developing the idea of consumer surplus, I don't use the textbook example of the used textbook market, for instance, where students might find themselves either on the supply or demand side. I use, in Vietnam, the example of the used motorbike market, where all those students have exactly that experience. A third aspect to this would be to think of diverse policy questions from around the world that could provide good examples of what we're trying to teach. So suppose we have our students engaged and interested and connected. Then what ideas might we have that are especially useful for crossing these international cultural barriers when it comes to letting students hear, absorb, comprehend, and integrate the knowledge we're trying to convey? Well, needless to say, one would be pay special attention to our speed and elocution when we're speaking. Lots of us come from very different linguistic backgrounds. I mean, look at our faculties. We're often very international ourselves. We have lots of different issues, perhaps, that each of us brings to the classroom in terms of speed, accent, style, and probably even by watching ourselves on video, we can make ourselves more aware of our personal issues and what we might pay most attention to make sure we're communicating, as effectively as possible to our students. Number 6, welcome audio recording and phone photo shots in class. Now, it's many years ago already that international students first approached me and said, can I please record your lecture, with a little handheld recorder. And of course, that's become pretty normal in some ways. It's only much more recently that I've got students taking pictures in class, with their phones. And I was a bit taken aback by that at first, but I actually have come not only to accept it, but to really value it as a way to make sure that whatever I have developed across the whiteboard, it can be successfully recorded for later comprehension by students if it's not immediately obvious. Idea number 7, reiteration. Now there are a few different ways to think about this. One is, of course, it's natural, it's common sense. If you ask a question and a student gives an answer back, or if a student asks a question, to restate it, right? So that everyone can hear it, that's a natural classroom tactic. But it's maybe not only that. Not only restate questions or answers or key concepts, but rephrase them using different vocabulary, different sentence structure, different ways of expressing the same idea that will connect to different brains in different ways depending on where that person is coming from linguistically as well as other aspects of culture. And third, communicating multi-modally. Now, even, if we had completely a class full of domestic students, we know that some students are visual learners, right? Some are oral learners, and so it helps to, say, simultaneously say something out loud and also present it in writing so they can absorb it either way. Well, this is even more helpful when we're dealing, I think, with international students and both cultural and language barriers. Number 8, provide clear grading rubrics. Okay, obvious enough. Offer examples of successful papers. So, if your institution is like mine, we're constantly striving to make expectations clearer. And one of those ways is to provide grading rubrics. This used to seem like a grade school thing to me, and now I've come to accept it as very useful for students. And then especially, and actually this goes back to my own experience as a student abroad in France, providing examples of a good paper, for example. What does a good paper look like in our academic culture with our expectations, not just a list of what you get points for, but actually the structure and style. Idea number 9, invite word meaning inquiries during tests so that students really have a chance to show their knowledge in ways that aren't confused by extraneous details. Not much more to say about that, except that I would emphasize the word invite, to actually invite that kind of inquiry. And idea number 10, encourage use of office hours. In many academic cultures abroad, there's a very strong barrier constructed between the student and the professor. And students who come to the United States may never realize the level of access that they have for individual, informal, private conversation with faculty members. And they may also not recognize the learning value of that kind of conversation and how it's actually an expected part of our culture. So a little bit of extra coaching, I think, even beyond what we might do for our domestic students. Well, to finish, let me just re-emphasize how much value I think there is to having a globally diverse classroom and how much stimulation and reward I find in doing that, and that there are many strategies besides these, which, again, there's nothing new here, but that help us reach international students and our domestic students alike with the same tools.